This is Smart Money Explained, where finance is broken down clearly, without hype, opinions, or predictions.
Today, we're not just, looking at spreadsheets or reading headlines. We're really trying to get into the emotional core of personal finance.
Yeah.
We want to cut through all that noise to find the signal, that little piece of truth that's kind of buried under all the anxiety and, frankly, the staggering debt figures we all hear about.
And it's such a critical thing to do because the story of American finance, it really lives in two completely separate worlds.
Yeah.
On one side, you've got these raw, very high stakes personal stories, the incredible successes people have, but also the confusion, the real anxiety millions of people are facing.
And on the other?
On the other, you have these huge, almost sterile-seeming data sets that policymakers and researchers use. Our job today is to try and bridge those two worlds for you, the learner, and figure out how they connect.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've pulled our material from two very different universes. First, the super personal, often emotional stories shared on places like Reddit, student loans, financial independence, right poverty, finance.
Yeah, the real ground truth.
Exactly. And then we have the official sources, the big aggregate data from governments and nonprofits. We're talking about the CFPB, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the OECD, and even these massive web archives like Common Crawl.
So our deep dive today is really built on this central tension.
Right.
We want to understand how these individual success stories are happening, right? Often it's because of a temporary policy window or just sheer force of will from a high earner.
But at the same time, we have to look at the systemic pressures.
Exactly. Things like runaway housing costs, healthcare debt. These are creating structural barriers that just make the struggle so much harder for almost everyone else. We really want to see how that micro-level debt battle reflects the macro-level economic reality.
And maybe most importantly, what that actually means for your personal strategy. Let's get started with the emotional high, the debt freedom stories. I mean, these posts, they're just explosive. They're these moments of pure relief. And we're not just talking about small balances. These are life-changing six-figure payoffs that took years of just relentless focus. And the relief is almost, you can feel it coming off the screen.
Absolutely. And when you look at these cases of hyperspeed debt payoff, two things immediately jump out. You need a high income and you need really strategic timing.
The stars have to align.
They really do. Take the case of the person who paid off a massive $262,000 student loan balance.
Wow. $262,000. That's a mortgage.
It is a mortgage, and their story is really the blueprint for this kind of accelerated path. So they had $245,000 in principal and then another $17,000 in interest.
Okay.
And the key thing is they graduated from an MBA program in 2019. Now think about that timeline for a second.
So right before the pandemic.
Exactly. They had only a few months of normal standard repayment before that historic long-running interest rate pause for federal loans kicked in.
That pause was everything.
It was their tailwind. For 4 years, they could earn a high salary from their MBA job and just funnel every spare dollar they had, not at interest, but at chipping away at that massive principal.
So every payment they made was 100% effective. No money was being burned off by interest?
None. And they didn't just, spend a little less. They used that pause as a massive intentional saving period. They explicitly said that the interest rate pause, combined with their high income job, is what allowed them to make these huge principal payments near the end of 2023 and then just wipe out the entire thing this year.
Without that pause, the interest would have just kept piling up. They might have paid tens of thousands and just, stood still.
For sure. It would have added tens of thousands back onto their balance. It was a game changer.
And we saw an even more aggressive story. Someone paying off $366,000 in just a little over 2 years?
Yeah.
I mean, that scale and speed is almost unbelievable.
It is. And again, the recipe is the same, just sort of turned up to 11. High income job. Check. Leveraging the COVID forbearance. Double check.
So how did they manage it that fast?
Well, this person was making these aggressive $10,000 a month payments once the interest started up again. But the really brilliant part was what they did during the interest pause.
Okay.
They saved those massive potential payments. But they didn't just stick them in a regular checking account. They put them in a high-yield savings account.
Oh, that's smart.
It's genius. So when the interest was set to resume, they had this huge lump sum of cash ready to go, and it had been earning its own interest the whole time. They used that cash to make a massive payment right at the start.
So they were essentially arbitraging the system.
That's a great way to put it. They were arbitraging the difference between their zero-interest student loans and the 4 or 5% they were getting in their HYSA. It maximized their initial principal reduction in a huge way.
But, I mean, doesn't that just prove that the system is completely broken? If you need a high six-figure salary and a once-in-a-century interest pause to get out of debt in a few years, what hope does the average person have?
That's the question, isn't it?
These stories are amazing, but they also highlight this extreme level of financial privilege.
They absolutely do. And that contrast is exactly why we have to look at the people who don't have that high income, who don't have that perfect timing. We saw cases where the psychological distress of carrying debt drove people to make really radical, maybe even financially questionable decisions just to stop the anxiety.
The most extreme example was the 30-year-old who was just so desperate. They were watching their balance grow by $200 a month from interest alone, and they liquidated everything.
Everything.
Their life savings of $15,000 and their entire $32,000 401k.
Okay.
Just threw it all at the debt.
To hit a zero balance on your debt by starting over at zero net worth at age 30, that is a profound choice.
Any financial advisor would tell you that's a terrible idea.
Oh, absolutely. They would universally condemn it. You're losing all that future compounding growth, you're paying tax penalties, but that person's calculation wasn't financial. It was entirely emotional.
Yeah.
They valued the relief of stopping that interest clock, that constant feeling of running on a treadmill and going nowhere, more than decades of theoretical growth. And that decision, I think, it just speaks volumes about the mental bandwidth that student debt consumes.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the long haul story. This shows what it looks like when that high income fast track method just isn't an option. The person who finally paid off $129,000 over 28 years.
28 years!
Almost a whole career.
It is. That journey started with a bachelor's degree back in 2001, and then they got more degrees later, a master's in 2016. For the first 10 years, they said they just struggled to make any dent at all.
So what changed?
They finally got a good-paying job after 2013, but their strategy wasn't about leveraging a historic pause. It was just pure, unadulterated consistency.
Just grinding it out.
Grinding it out. They lived frugally, always paid more than the minimum, and aggressively threw every single bonus, every tax refund, even their initial hiring bonus, straight at the loans. That is the definition of a sustained, decades-long campaign that finally brought them some peace.
So once that celebration is over, or for people who are still striving for that zero balance, it seems like the administrative complexity of the whole system turns the repayment process into a complete nightmare.
Oh, it's a huge theme. This administrative tangle is one of the most consistent things you see in the user feedback. It really suggests that the servicing system struggles, and struggles significantly, with just basic accuracy and processing speed.
And the psychological impact must be immense.
Think about the user who was meticulously tracking their payments. They were working toward 300 payments for forgiveness. They saw their Mohalis statement finally click over to 300.
The moment of freedom.
You'd think so. They're expecting that email, that feeling of relief, but then the very next day, the counter flips back to 299.
Oh no, that's just soul-crushing.
It is. It's not just a clerical error in that moment. It's this profound moment of bureaucratic betrayal. It just destroys any trust you have in the system. And it shows how even routine things get so complicated. We saw another case. Someone overpaid a loan, creating a negative balance.
That is, they had a credit.
Exactly. And they spent over 3 months just trying to get the servicer to apply that overpayment to their other loans.
3 months.
3 months. And they were told these requests have to go through the Department of the Treasury. So for 3 months, that user's own money, their own funds, were just sitting there inaccessible while their other loans were still accruing interest.
That's a damaging bottleneck. Every week that $4,000 is just sitting idle is money that is not working for them.
Right. But the administrative chaos is, I think, most punishing for older borrowers, the ones with really complex histories.
Like the tragic story of the 57-year-old. They're now facing $100,000 in original principal.
Which is already a huge amount.
And then an additional, equally horrifying $100,000 in interest, a total of $200,000 in debt.
And that debt ballooned because their servicer, which was Navient at the time, had put the loan into an unexpected deferment for 18 years.
18 years, without them knowing.
It was a total shock to the borrower. They thought they were making payments, doing the right thing, and now they're being advised to consolidate just to try and untangle this mess with payments that are projected to last until they are 86 years old.
That's not just a life sentence. That's a failure of regulatory oversight A failure of servicing integrity.
100,000 in unnecessary interest. It's just, it's a system failure.
The one little glimmer of light in all this administrative fog seems to be the golden email. This is the thing that grants forgiveness to long-term borrowers, often to correct these exact kinds of past servicing errors.
Right, and we saw this ecstatic post from someone who got confirmation of their IDR forgiveness after hitting 304 payments on the old income-based repayment plan. That's 25 years of payments finally being validated.
That relief, having a quarter century of effort finally means something, that has to be the direct counterpoint to seeing your payment counter flip from $300 back to $299.
It's powerful for sure. But that forgiveness is happening right alongside some significant policy instability, and that is generating a whole new wave of anxiety for millions of people who are still trying to pay these things off.
We have to talk about the legal landscape, specifically what's happening with the SAVE plan.
Yes. We need to be really impartial here and just report what's happening. We saw the news about the settlement agreement with Missouri, which intends to end the SAVE plan. The Department of Education announced this.
But they haven't said what happens next.
Not yet. They said that the details on the transition, the mechanism, the timeline, what it's going to look like, all of that will follow. But for current borrowers who have built their entire budget around the low or $0 payments from SAVE, this creates this immediate, profound uncertainty about their future.
And that uncertainty translates instantly into very real fear. Fear about wage garnishment, about default.
And we saw a harrowing example of this. A user shared conflicting data from two official sources. Their account with Advantage, their servicer, showed a $0 payment due in January 2026.
Okay, so that's what they're expecting. That's their current status.
Right. But then, when they checked the official studentdata.gov website, the data was radically different. It showed a past due amount of $6,240.
Oh, wow.
And much worse, an impending garnishment start date also in January 2026.
So how is a borrower supposed to function? The two primary sources of official truth, the servicer and the federal government, are giving them completely contradictory high-stakes information.
You can't. This policy instability combined with bureaucratic error, it just fuels this panic cycle. I mean, if you're a person following your servicer's instructions for a $0 payment, but the official federal record says you're $6,000 past due and about to be garnished, that tangle is an active mechanism for financial destruction.
It just underscores why having very specific knowledge is like currency in this world.
Yeah. It is. We saw this detailed public service announcement post that listed exactly what hyper-specific information you need just to get accurate advice. The exact loan type, is it direct, FFEL, something else, the date of your very first loan, your income, your family size, your total debt.
You can't just say, I have student loans and expect any kind of real help.
Not at all. You need to know if consolidating is going to restart your forgiveness clock, especially if you're pursuing public service loan forgiveness. You need to know if your old loans even qualify for the IDR adjustments. We even saw users noting that the official loan simulator might miscalculate plans for older loans.
So even the official tools might be wrong.
One user said the calculated IBR number might be off by about a third for loans that are older than July 2014. So the burden of getting it right is entirely on the borrower, even when the data from the official sources is actively fighting with itself.
Okay, so we've established the student loan landscape is this mix of massive high-income success stories on one hand, and then this deep policy-driven administrative frustration on the other.
Right.
So what does all this mean when we zoom out? If debt is the problem, it's clearly not just isolated to higher education. These issues feel more like symptoms of broader structural barriers to financial health.
I think that's exactly right. And this is where those highly specific, sometimes desperate anecdotes you see in poverty finance forums really act as real-world confirmation for the anxiety that the big data tries to measure.
Right.
We saw this comprehensive breakdown from a personal finance educator who laid out several claims about why Americans are, in their words, statistically financially broke. And their analysis went way beyond the usual advice of, just cut out the lattes.
It was much more structural. It focused on costs you can't really avoid. First, housing. They argue that more than half of Americans are spending a staggering 50% of their take-home income just on rent.
50% just on rent.
That's before you buy food, pay for utilities, or make any debt payments.
That's mathematically unsustainable. The recommended historical max is closer to 30%? When rent eats half your paycheck, you are living in a permanent state of zero flexibility. Any unexpected bill, a car repair, anything, it just breaks you.
And the other big structural costs are just as crippling.
Yeah.
Healthcare is still cited as the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy in the U.S.
Still, after all these years.
Then there's transportation, which for most people is mandatory just to earn that paycheck in the first place.
Right.
The educator pointed out that the average new car is now hitting $50,000. A used car is $30,000. And the average monthly car payment is now a massive $700.
Often financed over 7 or 8 years, so you're paying thousands and thousands in interest, easily doubling the effective price of the car. It just traps families in this long-term, high-cost cycle.
And all this compounding pressure leads to a really shocking conclusion they made. The educator claimed that today, a worker needs to earn $100,000 a year just to break even.
And by break even, they meant covering necessary expenses, saving adequately for retirement, and taking one basic week-long vacation a year.
And the shocking part is the statistic they cited. 80% of workers in the U.S. do not earn that much.
80%. So 4 out of 5 workers are statistically below the financial break-even point.
That disparity right there, it explains everything. It explains why debt is perceived not as a personal failure of budgeting, but as a mandatory life installment.
Yeah.
You have to pay just to keep the lights on and the car running.
And that desperation leads directly to the next issue, high-interest debt.
Yeah.
The educator described credit cards as debt entrapment, with companies charging 20+% interest.
Maybe the most painful concept that really confirms this structural disadvantage is what's known as the poverty tax.
Yes.
Can you walk us through that? It sounds brutal, but I think the calculation is really important.
It's brutal because it's so insidious. The poverty tax is basically a financial premium you pay because you don't have enough cash flow to buy things in bulk. It is a direct penalty for being poor. One user meticulously tracked their expenses for a month, and they calculated that buying the small sizes of things, the small jar of peanut butter, the single-serve bags of rice, because that's all that fit their weekly budget, it cost them an extra $47 that month compared to if they'd had enough cash up front to buy the big bulk sizes.
$47. I mean, that might sound trivial when we're talking about $100,000 payoff.
But it's not.
But if you're in that 80% earning under $100,000, that $47 could be the difference between making a utility payment or not. It could be groceries for a week.
It's everything. And the system, by its very design, charges the poor more for essential goods. This is exactly the kind of micro-level friction that the big BEA metric, disposable personal income, can't capture. That metric in our source data only rose by 0.1%. But that 0.1% feels gigantic when you're losing $47 a month simply because you don't have an extra $20 on Monday to save yourself $47 by Friday.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle. The lack of funds forces you to pay a premium, which ensures your funds stay scarce.
Exactly. And beyond that systemic friction, we also see people facing these intense, sudden, high-interest debt crises that require really drastic action.
The credit card crisis is a big one. We saw a user who was grappling with $31,000 in credit card debt at a crippling 19.5% interest rate.
That's just a killer rate.
And their family received a massive, unexpected $25,000 windfall around Christmas. The user was actually debating whether they should throw all of it at the debt.
The fact that there's even a debate highlights how deep the crisis is. Of course, the answer is yes. That 19.5% interest is destroying their capital far faster than any safe investment could ever grow it. Using that $25,000 to drop the balance to $6,000 would buy them immediate freedom from that crushing interest.
And the psychological relief.
Immense. This kind of high-interest consumer debt is a true 5-alarm financial fire. It requires extreme intervention.
Then you have the situations that are less about numbers and more about, betrayal. Like that dramatic story from the 24-year-old who discovered their family had stolen their identity.
Yeah, that was a devastating story. It's a prime example of debt being forced on someone. This user went home for Christmas from college and discovered their family had opened and then defaulted on a $12,000 personal loan in their name.
And that wasn't all.
No. They had also maxed out 3 credit cards, also in the user's name. So in total, it was over $30,000 in secret debt that was now legally the student's responsibility.
The betrayal is just. It's profound. The user was working multiple jobs, skipping meals to pay their own tuition in cash, trying to be as responsible as possible.
While their identity was being used by their parents to fund their own toxic financial habits, and when confronted, the parents just admitted, "We had to survive." It shows you how financial desperation can just completely override familial ethics. For many people, debt isn't a choice, it's a catastrophic violation.
And finally, a textbook example of predatory practices. This one involves a mother who was convinced to take out a reverse mortgage.
Yeah, this is a classic case of financial literacy and desperation being exploited.
It's a perfect example of a massive, dangerous solution being applied to a relatively small problem. The mother had a $5,000 back property tax issue.
Right, an urgent problem, but a solvable one. But the solution she was sold was a reverse mortgage for $58,000.
$58,000 to solve a $5,000 problem. How does that even work?
Well, the transaction was structured so that $15,000 went straight to fees.
Wow. So the cost of getting the loan was 3 times the size of the original problem.
Exactly. And the rest of the money, about $34,000, was put into an escrow account to pay her property taxes and insurance for the next 15 years. So in the end, she signed up for $58,000 in debt, putting the security of her home at risk, all to solve a $5,000 problem with a massive chunk going directly into the lender's pocket.
The user noted that it was all technically legal, but clearly predatory.
It preys on that desperation and fear of losing your home over what was a relatively minor tax bill. And it's a crucial takeaway. When the structural costs of living are so high, it pushes financially insecure people into these unique vulnerabilities. It makes them prime targets for predatory solutions, even for minor emergencies.
Okay, so let's move from that distress to a more strategic approach to wealth building. We can shift our focus to the people who are actively trying to construct a wall against all this systemic pressure.
Right, often under the banner of FIRE, financial independence, retire early.
And the core concept driving a lot of these successful stories isn't necessarily massive immediate retirement. It's something that feels a lot more attainable and maybe psychologically more powerful. Coast FIRE.
Coast FIRE is such a powerful idea. It fundamentally shifts the conversation away from necessity and towards optionality.
Explain what that means.
It means you have enough money invested, usually in tax-advantaged accounts, like a 401k and market index funds, that compound growth alone, with no more contributions from you, will carry your portfolio to your full retirement target, say, at age 60.
So it's less about the money and more about the freedom. It's like buying the right to fail at a job you hate.
Exactly. Once you hit that Coast FIRE number, you can coast. You can take a less stressful, lower-paying job, you can cut your hours, or focus on a passion project, all without jeopardizing your ultimate retirement security.
It removes that existential anxiety of being completely dependent on your job.
It does. And we found this incredible case study of someone achieving Coast FIRE on a single income. It was an H-1B visa holder who went from a $70,000 salary to $144,000 and built a net worth of over $1 million in 12 years.
All while supporting a family of 3 and dealing with the constant uncertainty of being on a visa.
Yeah, basically playing life on hard mode. Their story is a masterclass in focused execution, but it's also a lesson in some really painful missed opportunities.
So what were the key takeaways from their journey?
The big acceleration in their progress came pretty late in the game. Specifically, it happened when they realized the massive power of tax-advantaged accounts. They only started maxing out their HSA, their Roth IRAs, and their 401k in the last few years.
But that late game push was the catalyst.
It was the critical catalyst that pushed them over the $1 million mark.
But you said there was a mistake. What was their biggest mistake?
It's so relatable, it almost hurts to read it. They admitted to keeping almost $100,000 in a Bank of America savings account earning, like 0.01% interest.
Ouch. For how long?
For 5 years, from 2013 to 2018. They were waiting to save up the full 20% down payment for a house.
So why did they do that? It sounds like they knew about investing.
It wasn't a lack of financial literacy. It was most likely the profound anxiety tied to their H-1B status. Having maximum liquidity felt like maximum safety.
I see. If they lost their job or had to leave the country, they needed that $100,000 immediately, with no penalties.
Exactly. They prioritized the psychological safety blanket of cash over what would have been guaranteed market growth over those 5 years. That loss compounding probably cost them hundreds of thousands in potential gains.
Now contrast that very conservative mistake with one of their best decisions, which was the 5% down house purchase in 2021.
A brilliant move. They locked in a fantastic 2.875% interest rate, and they found that the private mortgage insurance, the PMI, was only $100 a month.
So they did the math that a lot of people miss.
They did. By putting 5% down instead of waiting years to save the full 20%, they were able to invest the other 15%, tens of thousands of dollars, into the market.
And they figured the market would outpace the cost of the PMI.
By a long shot. They concluded that the invested money grew far more aggressively than the minimal cost of that PMI. It's a really compelling case for maximizing your time in the market, especially when you can lock in historically low interest rates.
But even for these high-achiever professionals, it seems like accumulating wealth doesn't get rid of the psychological games of goal setting. We saw the story of the lawyer who just kept moving their retirement goalpost.
Yes, a classic example of hedonic adaptation, but applied to net worth.
So what was their original target?
They started with an ambitious but, conceivable target of $1 million to retire abroad. Once they hit that, they moved it up to $1.5 million just to build in a safety buffer in case they wanted to return to the U.S.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then, once they hit $1.5 million, they decided they needed enough for a comfortable retirement in a medium cost of living area in the U.S. So, using a 3.6% withdrawal rate, they raised the target to $2.3 million.
And now, even after reaching $2.3 million, they're considering raising the goalpost again. To what?
To a massive $3.5 million.
Why such a huge jump?
It's driven entirely by minimizing perceived risk. First, they want to subtract the cost of a future home purchase, about $700,000 from their investable assets, so they need a higher number to start with. And second, they're trying to cushion themselves against systemic risk. The idea that historical rates of return might not hold up in the future. If their returns are lower than expected, they'll need a much higher principal to sustain the same lifestyle.
It's a key psychological trap in the FIRE community, isn't it? The ultimate goal stops being about crossing a finish line and becomes about achieving perfect security against any possible future economic stress.
It's never enough.
Now, moving from those mega numbers of FIRE down to the micro level, the frugal communities offer some incredibly sharp, practical advice on cost reduction. Basically, giving yourself an immediate raise.
This is all about stopping the financial bleed, which is often engineered by corporate strategies designed to keep you paying.
And the classic example we saw was the subscription audit.
Yes. One user canceled all their auto-charged, unused subscriptions. Things like the Panera Tip Club, LinkedIn Premium, Audible, Amazon Prime channels.
And what was the result?
They gave themselves a $2,058 per year raise.
That moment where you're both happy for the raise and also feels so dumb for letting it go on for so long, is pretty universal.
It is. It just highlights how consumer finance is structured to rely on these low-friction, high-retention auto charges. We trade small amounts of money to avoid thinking about it, and then we forget we're paying $9 per coffee for a Panera subscription we don't even use.
We also saw some really sophisticated strategies for cost-effective eating that kind of challenge the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, the realization that spending a little bit more on groceries can actually save you money. For example, buying the $5 organic burger patties.
Right. It seems more expensive up front.
But it's actually cheaper than the inevitable high-cost impulse of ordering an $18 Uber Eats meal when you open an empty fridge after a long day at work.
The high-quality, slightly more expensive item is the ultimate frugal choice because it successfully prevents the high-cost impulse buy that blows up your weekly budget.
You're paying a little more for ingredients to basically buy some psychological inertia against ordering takeout.
And the DIY savings insights were fascinating. They show this extreme dedication to self-sufficiency.
One person showed how strategically shopping for a big holiday meal, comparing prices unit by unit at Walmart, Target, and Kroger, could save $30 on a $140 meal.
So they didn't just go to one store.
No, they used unit pricing aggressively. They noted that every store won on something different. Walmart had the cheapest turkey, but Target had the cheapest butter. That diligence yields a 21% return on the time you invest in planning.
And for long-term self-reliance, the example of the man who cleaned and oiled his hair clippers.
Such a simple thing, a once-a-year maintenance on a cheap tool. But it allowed him to cut his own hair for 12 years, saving him well over $1,000 in skipped haircuts. That tiny act of care generates significant long-term savings.
My favorite hack, though, was the one that intersected science and cheap self-sufficiency, making your own disinfectant using hypochlorous acid.
This is chemistry meeting frugality at its absolute best.
So hypochlorous acid is what our white blood cells produce to destroy pathogens.
Exactly. And this user found they could make a powerful, non-toxic disinfectant at home for under $10. All you need is a $5 USB electrolysis dongle, salt, vinegar, and water.
So materials cost almost nothing?
Next to nothing. And the product is really effective saving a ton of money on commercial cleaning products. Now, they did note the process is still being dialed in to get the ideal pH of 5 and a chlorine count of 200.
So there are some chemical controls you need to be aware
All
of.
right. But the fact that they built a long-term, self-sufficient, and chemically precise cleaning solution for less than the cost of one bottle of commercial spray is a perfect illustration of how knowledge can translate directly into financial freedom.
So we spent most of our time down in the trenches, right?
Yeah.
Looking at these intense, specific financial realities and the inventive strategies people are using. Now let's pivot and look at how governments and researchers see this exact same landscape. It's through the cold, quantitative lens of massive aggregated data. And this is how policy gets made, informed by these huge economic measures that often miss all that micro-level friction we've been talking about.
That's a great way to put it. And we have to start with the foundational measures that are tracked by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA. The BEA provides that essential macro context for all the struggles and successes we've discussed.
And they track two key metrics for consumer health.
Right. Personal income and, I think more importantly, disposable personal income, or DPI.
Personal income is the broad measure, right? It's wages, salaries, Social Security, dividends, interest, everything. It gives us a sense of Americans' overall income growth potential.
But DPI, disposable personal income, is arguably the more relevant number for understanding financial flexibility. DPI is your after-tax income. It's the amount U.S. residents actually have left to spend or save after taxes, and all the mandatory deductions are taken out.
And the latest BEA data showed something really interesting. Personal income increased by plus 0.4% in September 2025.
But crucially, disposable personal income only increased by plus 0.1% in that same month.
That difference is the whole story right there.
It is.
When personal income grows by 4 quarters, but DPI only grows by 1, it means the government and mandatory deductions, taxes, fees, rising healthcare premiums, they're eating the other 3 quarters.
It's like getting a $100 raise and immediately having $75 clawed back before it even hits your bank account. That disparity income rising 0.4%, but disposable income only rising 0.1%, it shows that rising mandatory costs are just consuming a disproportionate share of any income growth.
It leaves consumers with very little actual extra money to save, invest, or pay off debt.
And it reinforces exactly why that 80% of people earning under $100,000 are constantly playing catch-up.
So from the BEA, we can turn to the regulatory body that's focused directly on these consumer markets, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB.
The CFPB's research and data programs are really the frontline intelligence for policymakers. They oversee the entire consumer financial marketplace. Their most critical function, I think, is acting as the financial industry's Waze.
What do you mean by that?
They show regulators where the traffic jams and accidents are happening in real time, and they do this through the Consumer Complaint Database. This captures thousands of specific consumer complaints about mortgages, credit cards, student loans, all of it.
So that database is vital because it moves beyond just the aggregate numbers. It gives policymakers these qualitative insights into where the market is breaking down. It lets them spot patterns in fraudulent or confusing activity that a big statistical model might miss.
Exactly. And they also publish these highly detailed monthly dashboards on consumer credit trends and mortgage performance trends, which includes delinquency rates, the very thing that terrifies that student loan borrower who's seeing conflicting data about garnishment.
And critically, the CFPB also operates the non-bank registry. Why is tracking non-bank financial institutions so important here?
Because non-banks, and this often includes student loan servicers like Mahila or payday lenders, are a massive and sometimes opaque part of the consumer market. They aren't regulated in the same way traditional banks are.
Okay.
The registry lists those non-banks that have registered information and are subject to government or court orders. It's a mechanism that's designed explicitly to detect and deter corporate offenders that have broken consumer laws in the past. Their work also includes these big reports on financial well-being, like the Making Ends Meet survey, which tries to connect quantitative data with the qualitative consumer experience.
So if the CFPB provides market surveillance, our next source, data.gov, provides the wide-open raw material for the entire U.S. government's research infrastructure.
Data.gov is the public hub for all of the U.S. government's open data, and it's currently got an astonishing 372,094 data sets. And its whole mission is to unleash the power of this data, everything from tax receipts to environmental data to inform policy, drive innovation, and strengthen government transparency. Any researcher or journalist or just a curious citizen can go in and access this aggregated, verified information to test their own theories about the economy.
And now, to connect this to the global context, we can look at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Right. The OECD provides that essential international view of financial stability. It focuses on macro policy guidance for financial markets, investment, and consumer protection on a global scale.
So if you think about the systemic pressures we discussed, like the 57-year-old facing debt until they're 86.
The OECD is focused on the long-term stability of those systems, things like national pension and insurance systems, especially when they're facing macro challenges like an aging population.
So while we're talking about the individual lawyer moving their personal Coast Fire goalpost to $3.5 million to protect their retirement,
institutions like the OECD are trying to create international standards to make sure that entire national pension systems don't collapse under demographic pressure, which would destabilize everyone's financial security, regardless of their personal net worth.
And finally, we look at the rawest, most expansive data source of all the open web itself, and how all those personal narratives we started with are being codified for research through projects like Common Crawl.
Common Crawl is a nonprofit that maintains this free, open repository of web crawl data. This is the fundamental raw material that's used to train the artificial intelligence systems that analyze our society, our behavior, and our financial language.
The scale is just mind-boggling. Over 300 billion pages spanning 15 years of the web.
With 3 to 5 billion new pages added every single month. This repository is cited in over 10,000 research papers, and it now serves as the massive raw corpus used for computational analysis and training large language models.
So when we read those deeply personal, emotional stories on Reddit in the first half of this deep dive, the agony over the $47 poverty tax, the frustration with Mohela, the ecstatic relief of debt freedom.
Those very words, those specific details, are ultimately scooped up by resources like Common Crawl.
The irony is incredible.
It's so rich. That single post, the mom who got taken advantage of by a reverse mortgage lender, that specific, painful financial vulnerability becomes an input variable. That story is literally teaching the next generation of financial algorithms about human behavior, about risk, and about how desperation presents itself in the real world.
And access points like the 636,860 data sets offered by Hugging Face can leverage this corpus
to teach AI about financial language and consumer patterns. So the personal pain of the individual is ultimately translated into a mathematical feature for models like DeepSeek Math or Scorpius. The individual struggle becomes the generalized data used to monitor the aggregate economy. Hashtag tag tagged outro.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've moved from the dizzying, hard-won relief of paying off $366,000 in student debt all the way to the cold, hard statistics of disposable personal income. And the core tension we analyzed, I think, is critical. It's the highly specific, deeply emotional financial stories shared in online communities versus the massive detached data sets used by the BEA and the CFPB to measure the economy.
And we saw that individual success is often driven by these small, consistent actions like aggressive saving and budget auditing, which can yield that instant $2,058 per year raise just by canceling subscriptions.
But that's combined with the fortunate timing of a high income or a government forbearance period.
Yeah.
The recipe for fast debt freedom seems to require a massive external tailwind.
Right. And conversely, we established that the systemic issues, healthcare as the leading cause of bankruptcy, half of Americans spending 50% of their take-home pay on rent, the insidious nature of the poverty tax, all of these actively amplify individual stress and just drain your mental capital.
These structural costs make it incredibly difficult for that 80% of workers who don't earn the $100,000 that's now deemed necessary just to break even.
So this raises the essential question, right? If the policy environment is unstable, as we see with the SEB litigation and the confusing communication around delinquency, and if job markets remain uncertain, where should you, as an individual, focus your finite energy for true financial security?
The most successful financial strategy we detailed today wasn't necessarily aggressive saving for a 20% down payment. It was a concept of Coast Fire.
Yeah.
Setting up your future self so that the anxiety about needing a high-stress job is removed. It gives you choice, not necessity. It buys you optionality against an unstable system.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to mull or explore on your own. Given the instability in policy, the administrative chaos, and the unrelenting pressures of systemic costs, is the ultimate lesson that true financial security today isn't really defined by the size of your paycheck, but by how quickly you can achieve the freedom to quit the job you hate without compromising your long-term future.
The only true hedge against systemic financial stress may be creating enough wealth to reclaim your time.
Thanks for listening to Smart Money Explained. If you found this episode helpful, follow the show so you don't miss future episodes covering investing, markets, and personal finance. This podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. We'll see you in the next episode.